The clock on the microwave read 11:43 when Daniel Mercer finally closed his daughter's bedroom door. He stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand still on the doorknob, listening to the particular silence of a child asleep that waited complete stillness that always made him feel like he was the last person awake in the entire world. Some nights that feeling was peaceful. Most nights it wasn't. He moved to the kitchen and poured what was left of the coffee, though it had been sitting since 2 in the afternoon and tasted like something between motor oil and regret. He drank it anyway. Sleep wasn't coming for at least another hour, and he'd learned 3 years ago that fighting that fact only made the nights longer. The apartment was small in the way that Boston apartments are small, not cramped so much as honest about what it was. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that opened into a living room where Mia's drawings covered the wall above the radiator like a gallery no museum would ever want, but every father would die for. The couch had a permanent indent on the left cushion where Daniel sat every night after Mia went to bed. The bookshelf was half his, half hers. Raymond Carver pressed against illustrated ocean encyclopedias, a collection of Chekhov stories wedged between a stack of library books about sharks. On the small table beside the couch, a coffee mug he never used anymore held a single pen. Next to the mug, sitting flat on the wood surface, was a watch. It was a woman's watch. Silver band, small face, the kind of thing that looked understated until you noticed the care in it. He'd bought it for Nora on their 4th anniversary because she'd mentioned once offhand that she'd always wanted a watch that looked like something her grandmother might have owned. He hadn't forgotten that. He'd written it down the same day she said it on a sticky note he kept in his wallet for 8 months until he found the right one. She'd cried when she opened the box, which was the reaction he'd wanted, and then she'd worn it every day for 2 years until she couldn't anymore. He didn't wear it. He couldn't bring himself to put it in a drawer either. So it sat on the table beside the couch, and sometimes he looked at it and sometimes he didn't, and either way it was there when he went to bed and there when he woke up, and that was enough. That was all he had figured out so far. He picked up his phone and opened the message thread for Mia. The thread was mostly him short messages sent late at night while she slept, because Nora had started the tradition when she was in the hospital during those last 8 weeks, and after Nora was gone he'd kept it without deciding to. It had just continued the way some things do, because stopping felt like cutting a wire, and he wasn't sure what the wire was connected to. He typed without looking at the screen. His thumbs knew the words the way his feet knew the floor plan in the dark. "Good night, little star. Daddy loves you." He added a star emoji. Hit send. Set the phone face down on the cushion beside him and picked up the Carver book he'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks. He read 2 paragraphs before the phone buzzed. He assumed it was the automated text from Mia's school, reminding him about the fall carnival permission slip he'd already submitted twice. He picked up the phone without looking and then looked, and the coffee turned to something colder in his stomach. The message thread was not Mia's. The contact name at the top of the screen read Victoria Strand. His phone had auto-completed to the wrong name Mia and Ms. Strand side by side in his recent contacts from the all-staff email he'd responded to on Monday. 2 letters apart. His thumb had pressed the wrong one in the dim light, half asleep, moving on muscle memory, and now the words he'd sent every night for 3 years to the daughter sleeping 20 feet away had landed instead in the message thread of the CEO of Halcyon Media Group. He read the sent message again. "Good night, little star. Daddy loves you." The star emoji blinked up at him. He sat completely still for 4 seconds, which is a long time to sit completely still. Then he did what every person does in this situation. He looked at the screen as though staring hard enough might reverse physics, delete the message, rewind the last 30 seconds of his life. The delivered notification sat beneath the words like a small, irrefutable verdict. 3 dots appeared. She was typing. Daniel set the phone down on the cushion with great care as though it were something that might detonate. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, stood at the counter looking at nothing for a moment, then walked back. Picked up the phone. The dots were still there. He was 43 seconds into the worst professional moment of his life when the dots disappeared. He exhaled. Maybe she'd deleted the thread. Maybe she'd put her phone down. Maybe she was composing something in her drafts that she would never actually send, and tomorrow at the office they would both pretend this had never happened, and he could go on living his careful, calibrated, quietly functional life without any additional disasters. The phone buzzed. Victoria Strand, wrong person, I assume. But whoever little star is, she's lucky. He read it 3 times. There was no anger in it. No formal CEO distance, no carefully worded HR speak designed to document the interaction for future reference. Just 11 words that landed with the particular weight of something said by someone who wasn't being careful anymore because it was late and they were tired and the armor had slipped just far enough. He recognized the register immediately, the way you recognize a sound without being able to name it, not because he knew Victoria Strand, but because he knew that particular kind of tired. He'd been living inside it for 3 years. He typed back, "Wrong contact. I'm sorry, Ms. Strand. That message was meant for my daughter." He deleted it. Started again. "I apologize. Completely my mistake. The message was intended for my daughter." Deleted that too. He sat for a long moment looking at the word daughter on his screen, half-typed cursor blinking. He sent, "I'm sorry. That was meant for my daughter. She's 8. I do this every night." He set the phone down again, stood up again, went to the kitchen again, drank the last quarter-inch of the terrible cold coffee standing over the sink, looking at the dark window above it, at his own faint reflection, looking back with an expression he didn't have a name for. The phone buzzed once more. Victoria Strand. "Don't apologize. Get some sleep." That was it. No further instruction. No indication of what Monday would look like, no signal of whether the next time he walked past her office, she would have already drafted a formal memo about appropriate use of company contact information. Just 4 words. Get some sleep. And underneath them, in the particular bluntness of a person who was genuinely tired and had briefly stopped performing something that felt almost like kindness. He didn't sleep for the long time after that. Sunday passed the way Sundays did. Mia's soccer practice in the morning, where Daniel stood on the sideline with a paper coffee cup and watched her chase the ball with a commitment that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with sheer refusal to be outrun. She scored once accidentally and celebrated with the full-body unself-consciousness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by joy. He took 3 photos without thinking about it and then stood looking at the camera roll, and for a moment he couldn't remember the last time he'd taken a photo of anything. In the afternoon, Helen Marsh came by with a container of soup she'd made too much of, which was her standard operating explanation for the twice-monthly deliveries that Daniel had stopped pretending were accidental. Helen lived in 4B with a tabby cat named Gerald and 30 years of opinions about everything, and she had appointed herself something between a neighbor and a fairy godmother 18 months ago, when Daniel's car had a flat in the parking garage, and she'd appeared with a spare and a look on her face that said she already knew everything relevant about his situation and had decided to be useful about it. She stayed for 40 minutes, told him Mia was getting taller, reminded him about the school's fall carnival for the 4th time, and left him with the soup and the specific low-grade guilt of being cared for when you haven't asked for it. Mia did her homework at the kitchen table while Daniel made dinner, and somewhere between the pasta water coming to a boil and the garlic hitting the pan, she looked up and said, "Daddy, if you accidentally tell someone something true, does it still count as telling them?" He turned from the stove. She was looking at her worksheet pencil, moving as though the question were no different from asking what was for dessert. "What do you mean?" His voice came out careful. "Like if you say something you meant to say to someone else, but the person who heard it, it was true for them too." She erased something, blew the eraser dust off the page. "Does the true part matter more than the accident part?" He watched her for a moment. 8 years old. Sea-green eyes inherited directly from Nora, the kind of eyes that made it difficult to believe you could hide anything from the person behind them. "Where is this coming from?" "Nowhere." She wrote something down. "We were talking about it at recess. Maya said accidents don't count. I said they do." "I think Maya might be wrong," Daniel said, and turned back to the garlic before it burned. He thought about that exchange for longer than made sense. She hadn't been talking about recess. He knew her well enough to know that the same way he knew which floorboard creaked at 2 a.m., which flavor of bad day called for a movie versus a walk, which silences meant she was processing and which meant she was simply content. He'd learned his daughter the way you learn a language you need for survival completely and without realizing you were doing it until the day you noticed you were fluent. He sent her the usual message at 11:30, double-checking the contact name twice before hitting send. Monday arrived with the specific cruelty of Mondays after you've spent the weekend replaying something you can't take back. Daniel was in the office by 8:15 earlier than usual on the logic that arriving before most people meant fewer witnesses to whatever expression was on his face. He set his coffee down, opened his laptop, and stared at the Orion project files without reading them. Owen Rafferty appeared at 9:07, dropped into the chair across from Daniel's desk, and looked at him the way someone looks at a crime scene they've just arrived at. "Sloan called me." Daniel didn't look up from his screen. "Why would Sloan call you?" "Because Sloan calls everyone when there's something interesting happening on the executive floor. It's her primary hobby." Owen leaned forward, forearms on knees. "Victoria wants to see you. 9 o'clock. Which was 9 minutes ago, so you might want to—" Daniel was already standing. The elevator to the 14th floor took longer than usual, or maybe it took the same amount of time, and he was just more aware of each second. The executive level of Halcyon Media Group occupied a corner of the building that faced northeast, and on a clear October morning the light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long, pale columns that made the space look like a photograph of itself. Minimalist furniture, low noise, the particular hushed quality of a floor where everyone understood that loudness was a form of weakness. Sloan Everett was at her desk outside Victoria's office, early 30s, sharp eyes, the kind of professional composure that suggested she had heard everything and categorized it before filing it somewhere inaccessible. She looked up when Daniel stepped off the elevator. "Mr. Mercer, go ahead in." A brief pause. "She's in a good mood." He couldn't tell if that was reassurance or a warning. He knocked on the glass frame of the open door. Victoria was at her desk facing her laptop, and she looked up when he knocked with an expression that told him exactly nothing about what was about to happen. This was, he understood, a skill. Victoria Strand was 39, though she looked both younger and older than that, depending on the context. Younger in the rare, unguarded moments, older in the way she carried the room when she walked into it. Dark hair pulled back, a charcoal blazer over a white shirt. Nothing about her appearance was accidental, but nothing was performative either. It was the look of someone who had decided a long time ago what they wanted to communicate and had simply maintained that decision ever since. "Close the door," she said. Not unkindly. He did. The click of the latch was very loud. "Sit down, Daniel." He sat, folded his hands in his lap, reminded himself not to speak first. She closed her laptop and looked at him with the attentiveness of someone who was actually looking, not scanning. "Before you apologize again, don't. I didn't ask you up here about Saturday night." He recalibrated. "Okay. I asked you up here about this." She opened a folder on the desk and turned it toward him. Printed pages project brief numbers in columns he recognized. The Orion account, the largest single contract Halcyon had pitched for in 2 years, a national media infrastructure overhaul for a healthcare network with locations in 11 states. The kind of project that, if executed correctly, would define the next chapter of what Halcyon was. He looked at the folder, looked at her, said nothing. "The proposal has your name on it," Victoria said. "The strategic framework, the positioning narrative, the client segmentation model. You built this." "I had help from the team. The team had the same information and produced different work. You produced this." She tapped the folder once with one finger. "I've been watching your work for about 8 months. The Caldwell campaign last spring. The redirect on Morrow Pharmaceuticals when the messaging wasn't landing. You have a way of finding what's actually true about a client and building around that instead of building around what they wish were true. That's rarer than you'd think at this level." He understood distantly that he was being complimented. He was having difficulty processing it because the rest of his mind was still waiting for the other part of this conversation to begin. "I want you to lead Orion," Victoria said. "Not contribute to it. Lead it. Own the client relationship, run the strategic vision, put your name on the deliverables." He looked at the folder again. The scope inside it, he'd built the proposal so he knew what it contained. 6 months of work, multi-city client meetings, presentations to a board of executives who would take apart every assumption and require him to defend each one. A project that, if it went well, would change the trajectory of his career in ways that felt almost abstract from where he was sitting. The timeline requires travel, he said. Chicago for the initial pitch, Seattle for the second phase review. Probably overnight for both. Yes. He looked at the folder one more time, then looked up. I have a daughter, 8 years old. My neighbor helps with pickup from school, but overnight trips are a different equation. I can't just... He stopped, started again. I appreciate this more than you know, but I have to be honest about what I can and can't take on. He expected the conversation to end there or to pivot into something diplomatic about finding another candidate. What he did not expect was the pause that followed, not the pause of someone computing how to handle a personnel problem, but the pause of someone actually thinking. What does she need? Victoria said. Your daughter. What does she need in order for you to travel when the project requires it? He blinked. The question was so direct and so specific and so entirely outside the register of any conversation he'd expected to have in this office that for a moment he didn't know how to answer it. Someone she knows, someone she trusts, not a stranger. He heard himself speaking as though from a slight distance. Helen, my neighbor, she's great with Mia, but she's 71 and overnight is a lot to ask. I've been looking at options, but I haven't. I'd like to propose something. Victoria folded her hands on the desk. Halcyon doesn't currently have a formal dependent care support program for employees with travel requirements. That's an oversight I've been intending to address. I'd like you to be the first to benefit from what I'm building, and in exchange, I'd like you to lead this project. He stared at her. You're going to build a company child care support program. I'm going to build it regardless. This is the right time to start. Her expression remained level, but there was something in it he hadn't seen before, not warmth exactly, but the intentional absence of coldness. I'm not doing you a favor, Daniel. I'm making a business decision. People do better work when they're not spending 20% of their mental capacity managing logistical anxiety about their families. The math is straightforward. It's not exactly standard. No, but neither is your work. She opened the laptop again, an indication that the meeting was approaching its natural end. Think about it. Talk to your daughter. Come back to me by Thursday. He stood, picked up the folder she'd pushed toward him, got as far as the door before something made him turn back. The folder had a creation date printed in the header, the way all of Halcyon's internal documents did, auto-stamped by the project management software the moment a new file was opened. He'd noticed it in his seat without consciously registering it the way you sometimes notice something peripheral before your brain is caught up to why it matters. The file had been created 3 weeks ago, before Saturday night, before the wrong message, before the 3 dots appearing in the dark, before any of this. She had opened this folder and typed his name into it 3 weeks before any of it happened. He looked at the date, looked up at her. She was already reading something on her screen, and she did not look up to confirm or explain, and somehow that was more significant than any explanation would have been. He walked back to the elevator with the folder under his arm, and the distinct sensation of the ground shifting slightly beneath a life he'd thought he had mapped. Owen was waiting at Daniel's desk with the expression of a man who had been trying to look like he wasn't waiting. Well, Daniel set the folder down, sat. She offered me Orion. Owen's mouth opened, closed. Orion. The Orion. There's only one. Daniel. Owen leaned forward and lowered his voice to the register he used for things he considered genuinely important. I have been at this company for 6 years. I have never seen Victoria Strand come down to this floor. She summons people to her. That's the whole architecture of how she operates. And she has spent the last 3 weeks, I have now been informed, creating a file with your name on it for the biggest account this company has touched in 2 years. He paused. What did you send her? A message meant for my daughter. Owen looked at him for a long time. You sent your CEO a goodnight message. It was an accident. Obviously it was an accident. Owen sat back in his chair. But she didn't have to respond the way she did, and she didn't have to call you up there this morning, and she definitely didn't have to build you a child care support program." He tilted his head. "That folder existed before Saturday." "I know." "Which means she was already thinking about you. She was thinking about the Orion project, and she decided I was the right person to lead it." Owen gave him the look. "Sure." Daniel picked up his coffee. "It's more complicated than that." "It always is." Owen straightened his jacket. "I'm just saying she answered your message at midnight, and the answer was kind." He shrugged in the way of someone who considers the matter settled. "That's not nothing." He didn't tell Mia right away. He went through the afternoon on something like autopilot. A 2:30 call with the Caldwell team about Q4 deliverables, a hallway conversation with the art director about the Morrow campaign's second round, a walk to the coffee cart on the second floor where he stood in line and thought about the creation date on the folder and tried to figure out what he actually felt about it. What he felt when he located it underneath the professional analysis and the logistical math was something he hadn't felt in a while. Not excitement exactly, something quieter. The specific sensation of a door opening in a room you'd forgotten was part of the house. He picked Mia up from school at 3:30, which he managed on Tuesdays and Thursdays when his schedule permitted. She came out of the building in the middle of a group of kids and broke away when she saw him not running exactly but walking fast, which at 8 was the version of running she'd decided was acceptable on school property. She had paint on her left hand and a drawing tucked under her arm. "How was it?" "We did perspective today, like how to make things look far away." She showed him the drawing as they walked a street receding into a horizon, buildings getting smaller, the technique imperfect, but the ambition clear. "Mrs. Galloway said mine was one of the best." "It is one of the best." "You have to say that." "I also happen to mean it." She considered this as a fair point and tucked the drawing back under her arm. They walked the 6 blocks to the apartment in the particular easy silence that had taken them 2 years to build, the kind where neither of them felt the need to fill it where the city noise was company enough. At the apartment she did homework at the kitchen table while he made dinner, same as every night, and somewhere in the middle of it she looked up and studied him the way she sometimes did, with a quality of attention that always reminded him of Nora. "Something happened today," Mia said. It wasn't a question. "A few things happened today. It was Monday. Something at work." She went back to her math sheet. "You're doing that thing where you're here but you're also somewhere else." He was quiet for a moment. "I was offered a big project. An important one." "What kind?" "The kind that would mean traveling sometimes. Not often, but sometimes." She looked up again. "Overnight. A few times, maybe." She processed this with the gravity she applied to most things. "Would Helen be here?" "We'd figure it out. I'd make sure you were completely fine before I went anywhere." Mia turned her pencil over, erasing something. "Is the project something you want to do?" He thought about the folder, about the framework inside it that he'd built over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Mia was asleep, assembling something out of research and instinct and whatever it was he did when he was working at the level where it stopped feeling like work. He thought about handing it off to someone else, watching the Orion account become someone else's success story. "Yes," he said, "it's something I want to do." "Then you should do it." She returned to her homework with the matter-of-fact finality of someone who considers the decision made. "We always figure things out." He looked at the back of her head, at the dark hair she'd started insisting on braiding herself, even though the result was consistently lopsided, at the focused set of her small shoulders. He thought about the tradition they'd built, message by message, in the years since Nora. The way the two of them had assembled a life from the pieces of a different one, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of improvisation, and how most days it held. "Hey, Mia." She looked up. "If you accidentally tell someone something true, does the true part matter more than the accident part?" She gave him the look she'd inherited directly from Nora, the one that said she was deciding whether you deserved the full answer or just the short version. "I already told you my opinion on that." "I know. I'm asking again." "Yes," she said. "The true part always matters more." She went back to her homework. "Maya is still wrong." He turned back to the stove. Outside the kitchen window, Boston was doing what Boston does in October, going about its business under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue, the light thin and clear, and making everything look a little more itself than usual. He stood there for a moment before he remembered the garlic. Later, after Mia was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and the watch was in its place on the table beside the couch, he sat with the Orion folder open on his lap and read through what he'd built, the positioning framework, the phased approach, the central argument about what made the client's story true rather than just serviceable. It held up. He'd known it held up. What he hadn't known until this morning was that someone else had seen it clearly enough to act on it before he'd even offered it. He thought about Victoria's office, the ghosts of an expression in a controlled face, the creation date on the folder, the 11 words sent at 1:45 by someone who had briefly stopped being careful. He picked up his phone, opened Mia's contact, typed the message, slowly checking the name twice before he sent it. "Good night, little star. Daddy loves you." He set the phone down on the cushion, looked at the watch on the table, looked at the folder in his lap. He didn't close the folder. He read it all the way through. Tuesday morning, Helen knocked at 7:45 with a thermos of coffee and the energy of someone who had information to dispense. She settled herself on the couch while Mia finished breakfast in the kitchen and looked at Daniel with the particular satisfaction of a person who has correctly predicted something. "You're going to take the project," she said. He handed her a mug. "I haven't decided." "You've decided. You're just making sure you've thought about it long enough to feel responsible about the decision you've already made." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "She offered you support for Mia." "How do you know about that?" Helen smiled in the way of someone who considers the question its own answer. "Mia told me. She said her dad got offered something important at work, and they're figuring out the details." She paused. She said it like it was already resolved. He looked toward the kitchen where he could hear Mia explaining something to herself under her breath the way she did when she was reading. "She said we always figure things out." "She's right." Helen sipped her coffee. "She's a remarkably sensible child given everything." A pause. Nora was sensible too. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Helen stood at 7:55 to walk Mia to school, her Tuesday routine, the thing she'd started doing 8 months ago and which had become load-bearing in ways neither of them had planned. At the door, Mia turned back and pointed at him. "Take the project, Daddy." The door closed. He stood in the kitchen with the thermos Helen had left and the specific feeling of being outvoted by people who loved him, which was not the worst feeling in the world, and looked at the Orion folder on the counter where he'd left it last night. He picked up his phone and sent Victoria Strand a single message, professionally worded and appropriately brief, confirming that he would be in her office at 9 Thursday morning with his answer. He was reaching for his jacket when he stopped, looked at the table, the watch sitting where it always sat, silver in the October light, patient in the way only objects can be patient. He stood there for a long moment, then picked up his keys and left for work, and the watch stayed where it was, and neither of these facts surprised him. Thursday came with the kind of cold clarity that October produces in Boston when it decides to be serious about itself, the air sharp enough to feel like a warning, the sky an unambiguous blue that offered no comfort and no apology. Daniel arrived at Victoria's office at 8:58, which was not early enough to seem anxious and not late enough to seem careless, and he understood as he stepped off the elevator that he had spent actual mental energy calculating this, which told him something about where his head was that he chose not to examine too closely. Sloane looked up from her desk with the same composed neutrality she brought to everything and gestured toward the office with a small nod. Victoria was standing at the window when he entered, not at her desk, which was different from last time. She was looking at the harbor, and for the 3 seconds before she heard him, and turned, she looked like someone who had been thinking hard about something that had nothing to do with quarterly projections. She turned, the expression resolved into the familiar, controlled attentiveness. "You've decided. I'll take the project." He sat without being asked this time. "I spoke with Helen, my neighbor. She's willing to be more involved when travel comes up, and I'd like to meet whoever Halcyon brings on for additional support before I commit them to anything. Mia needs to feel comfortable with whoever is in her space." Victoria sat across from him. That's reasonable. I'll have Sloan coordinate introductions before the Chicago trip. She opened a folder, a different one this time, operational rather than conceptual. The initial pitch is 6 weeks out. We fly out Monday, present Tuesday afternoon, return Wednesday morning. I'll be attending the Chicago meeting personally. He absorbed this. Because of the client, Patricia Weller runs Meridian Health as though it's her own family business, which in many ways it is. She built it from a regional network into a national operation over 20 years, and she doesn't commit to strategic partners. She hasn't looked directly in the eye. She'll want to see that Halcyon's leadership is personally invested in her account. Victoria set the folder down. It also happens to be true. He nodded, looked at the project timeline she'd pushed across the desk. 6 months of structured phases, client touchpoints mapped against internal deliverables. The whole architecture of what the next half year would look like laid out in columns he'd have to fill with actual work. It was exactly as large as he'd known it would be, and sitting across from the person who had decided he was the right one to carry it, he felt the particular combination of resolve and vertigo that attaches itself to things worth doing. "There's one more thing," Victoria said. She paused in the way of someone choosing how to say something rather than whether to say it. "The team that supports you on Orion will report through you. Your decisions on the account are final. I'll be available for strategic alignment, but I won't be managing around you." She met his eyes directly. "I say this because some people, when they're new to this level, wait for permission they already have. Don't do that." He looked at her, thought about the folder with the creation date 3 weeks back, thought about what it meant that she'd assembled the strategic case for this before anything personal had happened between them, before the wrong message, before any of this, which meant her confidence in him was professional and pre-existing and entirely separate from whatever else was currently unresolved in the air of this room. "I won't," he said. She nodded once, closed the operational folder. 6 weeks. Don't waste them." The 6 weeks did not go to waste. They went to something closer to controlled combustion. Daniel rebuilt his daily architecture from scratch. He was in earlier and sometimes out later, though he kept the 3:30 school pickups on Tuesdays and Thursdays as non-negotiable, which was a decision he'd made without deliberating on it, and which he did not revisit. The Orion work had the texture of the kind of problem he'd been built for. Not just the positioning framework which he'd already built, but the deeper question of what Meridian Health actually needed to hear about itself versus what it had been hearing for years from consultants who sold them their own assumptions back at a markup. He was 3 days into the research phase when he found the discrepancy in their public-facing messaging, the gap between what the organization claimed to prioritize and what its actual patient outcome data demonstrated, and he felt the specific charge of recognizing a true thing that everyone else had politely agreed to overlook. He wrote it into the framework with the care of someone dismantling something in order to build it better. Mia met the caregiver Halcyon arranged on a Saturday morning 2 weeks before Chicago. A woman named Beverly, who had raised 3 children, worked with 2 other families in similar situations, and arrived at their apartment with a container of homemade jam and the unflappable calm of someone who had seen everything and found most of it manageable. Mia studied her for approximately 7 minutes before declaring that she had an acceptable opinion about ocean animals and could therefore be trusted. Beverly accepted this criterion without comment. Daniel considered it the most successful job interview he'd ever witnessed. At the office, the Orion team assembled itself into a functional unit over the course of several weeks. 4 people who had been chosen by Daniel based on the specific combination of skills the project needed, not on who was available or who had seniority or any of the other organizational shortcuts that produced mediocre results. Owen made a comment about the selection process being unusually deliberate for someone who hadn't led a team at this level before. Daniel told him that was precisely the point. Victoria moved through his professional life during those 6 weeks with a quality he hadn't expected present, without intruding, available without creating dependency, appearing at the edges of the Orion work in ways that were always useful and never felt like oversight. She stopped by his floor once, which Owen noted was historically unprecedented, to look at the client research spread across his conference table and ask 3 questions that each identified a gap he hadn't fully closed. She did not tell him how to close them. She asked the questions and walked away, and he spent the next 2 evenings answering them. He started noticing other things. The way she kept a chair empty beside the head of the table in every conference room she used. He'd first seen it in her office during their Thursday meeting, and then again in the large third-floor conference room during an all-hands session, and once more in the small room on 12 where the Orion team did their weekly alignment. Always the same one chair beside her, unoccupied, never explained, never acknowledged. He didn't ask about it because asking felt like touching something he hadn't been invited to touch, but he noticed. He also noticed that she was almost always the last person to leave the building. He knew this because he was often among the last himself, and twice in those 6 weeks he passed her office on his way to the elevator and saw the light still on, saw her at her desk, with the particular stillness of someone deep inside work, rather than performing the appearance of it. Both times he kept walking. Both times he was aware with a precision he found mildly inconvenient that he had considered stopping. Chicago was cold the way cities built on wind are cold, the temperature technically the same as Boston, but the wind doing something to it, finding every gap in every jacket, making it feel like the weather had a personal grievance. They flew out on a Monday morning first class because Halcyon's travel policy for senior-level client engagements had a standard it maintained without apology, and Daniel sat beside the window and reviewed the presentation while Victoria read through Meridian Health's most recent annual report with a pen in her hand and a quality of attention that suggested she had not accepted the document's conclusions at face value. They worked through most of the flight in the comfortable parallel of two people who had learned each other's rhythms without naming the process of learning them. Somewhere over the flat middle of the country, Victoria put down the annual report and looked out the window for a long moment at the clouds below, and then said without turning, "You found the outcome data gap." 3 weeks ago. He set down his own documents. "I've been building the argument around it." "Good. Weller will know it's there. She's looked at it and decided it's too complicated to address directly. We're going to tell her it's the most important thing she can address, and we're going to show her how." She turned from the window. She's not going to like hearing it. Nobody likes hearing the thing they've been avoiding. She was quiet for a beat. "No, they don't." She looked at him with something that was nearly a smile, not the professional acknowledgement he'd seen at the office, but something less controlled, quicker, the kind that escapes before the person has decided to allow it. But they remember who said it when everyone else wouldn't. The hotel was in the loop, 40 floors of glass, and the kind of lobby that announced its own seriousness with understatement rather than excess. They checked in and agreed to meet at 6 for dinner to run through final logistics, and Daniel went to his room and immediately called Mia on the video call they'd scheduled the night before. Mia was at the kitchen table with Beverly flour on both hands in the middle of something that appeared to involve an ambitious quantity of dough. "Daddy, we're making pretzels, real ones with the boiling step." "That sounds complicated." "Beverly says anything worth eating requires at least one step that seems unnecessary but isn't." Mia held up her hands to show the flour distribution. "How's Chicago?" "Cold. I just got here." "Did you see any architecture yet? Mrs. Galloway showed us pictures. The buildings are famous." "I've been inside since I landed." Mia's expression suggested this was a failure of priorities. "You should look at things, Daddy. That's why you take pictures." He hadn't taken a picture since the Sunday of Mia's soccer practice a month ago. He hadn't taken it deliberately with intention. He'd pulled out his phone and pointed it at his daughter and pressed the button out of something reflexive, and then stood looking at the result for longer than the moment warranted. He didn't know what to do with the fact that his daughter had noticed or that she'd connected it to something real about him. "I'll look at things," he said. "Are you okay? Is Beverly?" "Daddy." Mia's voice held the patient authority of someone addressing an unnecessary question. "We're making pretzels. We're great. Go have your dinner." He changed into the dark jacket he'd packed for the evening and met Victoria in the lobby at 6, and she had also changed dark trousers and a burgundy blouse that was professional without being armor, and her hair was down in a way he hadn't seen at the office. He registered all of this in the space of approximately 2 seconds, and then relocated his attention to a neutral point slightly above her left shoulder and held it there by force of discipline while they fell into step toward the restaurant Sloane had booked 3 blocks east. The restaurant was the kind of place that understood its own quality without announcing it. Dark wood, good light, a room designed to make conversation feel private even in proximity to other people. They ordered and ran through the logistics of Tuesday's pitch, the order of the presentation, the likely objections, the specific framing of the outcome gap argument that would land as illuminating rather than accusatory. The work conversation was easy in the way their work conversations had become over 6 weeks, direct, efficient, neither of them ornamenting their communication with hedges or social upholstery. Then the food arrived, and the work conversation reached its natural end, and they were in the different territory that follows. Victoria poured wine from the bottle they'd ordered and set the glass down and said without particular lead-up, "How long has it been?" "Since Nora." The directness of it, not asking if she could ask, just asking, with the assumption that a direct question deserved the respect of being posed directly, landed differently than it would have from anyone else. 3 years in February. And Mia was 5. She was 5 when it happened. He turned his wine glass once. She remembers Nora, but the memories are starting to have that quality where you're not sure anymore which ones are real and which ones you've built from photographs and stories. She talks about it sometimes. She's pretty honest about it. She gets that from someone. Victoria's delivery was dry enough that it took him a moment to understand it was a compliment. The honesty. "I don't know how to lie to her. She's always been able to tell." He looked at his plate. Nora was the same way. She had this quality of, she paid attention in a way that made you feel like trying to hide something would be insulting to her intelligence. It was annoying sometimes. I miss it every day. The table was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant window, the Chicago evening was doing its business, cabs and pedestrians, and the amber light of the city in autumn. Victoria set her wine glass down with care. "My engagement ended 5 years ago." She said it the way people say things they've decided to say before they can talk themselves out of it. "His name was James. We met in business school, got engaged 2 years later. We were well matched on paper. Professionally, intellectually, he wanted the partnership version of ambition where both people are building toward the same thing. I wanted to build something of my own. That's not a character flaw." He disagreed. The word came out level, but not light. He held a press conference, actual journalists. He wanted everyone to understand publicly that the engagement was ending because I was, his phrasing, incapable of prioritizing anything other than my own advancement. She looked at the window rather than at Daniel. "I was 34. I'd been CEO of Halcyon for 8 months. I found out about the press conference from a news alert on my phone." He absorbed the specific cruelty of that, not just the betrayal, but the method of it, the performance, the deliberate conversion of something private into public record. He wanted to be the one who left, on his terms, in front of witnesses. "Yes." She turned back from the window. There was something in her face that was not pain exactly, more like the scar tissue over pain, smooth and permanent. "I went back to work the next morning. I've been working ever since. That's one strategy. It's the only one I had." She looked at him steadily. "I'm better at it than I am at most of the alternatives." He thought about his own alternatives. The apartment, the watch on the table, the way he'd moved through the first year after Nora, like someone navigating a building where all the furniture had been rearranged, familiar space wrong, geometry, constant low-grade collision. The Carver book he couldn't finish. The camera he'd put in the drawer and not taken out again until last month without understanding why. "I don't think we're actually better at the work than we are at the alternatives," he said. "I think we just have more practice at convincing ourselves." Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the small distance of the table and touched his hand. Not a romantic gesture, not a professional one. Something in between those categories that didn't have a clean name. It lasted 3 seconds before she withdrew her hand and picked up her wine glass again, and she didn't explain it, and he didn't ask her to, and the table between them felt both exactly the same as before and entirely different. They walked back to the hotel afterward, and the cold had deepened into the kind of evening cold that makes the lit windows above the street look like small declarations of warmth against the dark. She asked about Mia's ocean animal phase. He told her about the fish tank that had not survived first contact with reality, about the 3 funerals conducted at the kitchen sink with the gravity of state occasions, about Mia's conclusion that goldfish were simply not built for apartment life, and that the ocean was a better arrangement for everyone. Victoria laughed, not the small professional acknowledgement he'd heard at the office, but a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it changed her face entirely. He catalogued it without meaning to store it somewhere he didn't examine. At the elevator bank he pressed the button. They stood side by side in the brief waiting silence, and then the elevator arrived and they stepped in, and the doors closed, and the small enclosed space was suddenly aware of itself in a way lobbies aren't. She spoke first. "I'm going to say something that might be outside the appropriate register of this conversation." "Okay." "I've been watching you work for 8 months, she said. "And in the last 6 weeks I've had more conversations worth having than I had in the preceding year. And I think you know that this," she paused, precise in the way she was always precise, "is something." He looked at her directly. "Yes, I know that." She held his gaze. "Then you also know why I'm going to say what I'm about to say." The elevator was slowing. "Tomorrow is important. For Meridian, for Orion, for everything we've been building toward. And we've both been hurt enough to know that decisions made at 11 o'clock in a hotel elevator deserve more than the moment." The doors opened. Neither of them moved for 1 beat, 2 beats. "So whatever this is, and I'm not pretending it isn't something we do it right, or we don't do it at all." "Doing it right," he repeated. "What does that look like?" "It looks like Tuesday going well. It looks like getting back to Boston. It looks like talking when we're not in a hotel at the end of a long day with—" She gestured slightly at the space between them, which encompassed all of it, the dinner and the wine, and the laughing and the hand across the table. All of this creating a context that makes honesty difficult to calibrate. He stepped out of the elevator, turned back. "For what it's worth, I know what's true and I know what's just the situation. I've been telling the difference for 3 years. She looked at him for one long moment. Then, "Good night, Daniel." Quiet and even. The doors closed. He stood in the corridor for a few seconds, then walked to his room. Tuesday hit like a wave that had been building offshore since October. The kind of pitch meeting that starts professional and ends with everyone in the room understanding something has shifted. Patricia Weller was 61, gray-haired and possessed of the specific alertness of someone who had built something real with her own hands and consequently had no patience for being told what she wanted to hear. She sat at the head of Meridian's conference table with 4 of her senior executives and looked at Daniel from the moment he stood up with the particular attention of someone deciding whether to trust a new structure with actual weight. He showed her the gap, not as an indictment, as a map. Here is what your data says. Here is what your messaging says. Here is the distance between them. And here is why that distance is the most valuable thing in the room right now, because it tells us exactly where to build. He watched her face while he spoke, not to calibrate his delivery to her reaction, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how she heard the thing he was saying, and at some point in the second half of the presentation, he saw her lean forward slightly, the specific lean of someone who has stopped evaluating and started thinking. 90 minutes. 3 major objections from the CFO, each of which Daniel answered with a specificity that precluded further debate without making anyone defensive. When he finished, Patricia Weller tapped the table once with 2 fingers the way you'd mark a period at the end of a sentence and looked at Victoria. "You told me he was good. When exactly did that start being an understatement?" Victoria's response was brief and accurate, and contained exactly no inflection that would register as anything other than professional. "His instincts have always been good. He's been the right person for this since before we were in this room." Contract negotiations went 2 hours and ended with terms that were better than the proposal had outlined, which is the outcome you get when the client trusts you enough to tell you what they actually need rather than what they asked for. Walking out of the Meridian building into the Chicago cold, Daniel felt the specific release of adrenaline that follows something executed at the level it deserved to be executed at, not relief exactly, more like the stillness after a sustained effort where everything held. "You were extraordinary in there," Victoria said, not a compliment constructed to manage him, a fact stated with the directness she applied to everything. He looked at her. The afternoon sun was at a low angle, and the city was doing something beautiful with the light, and he thought about what Mia had said about taking pictures, about looking at things. "When we get back to Boston," he said, "I'd like to have dinner, not a business dinner, a dinner where we're not colleagues at the end of a successful pitch, but just a dinner." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. "When we get back to Boston," she said. "Yes." They flew home Wednesday morning, and the professional distance they maintained in the airport and on the plane felt like an agreed-upon courtesy rather than a wall. He sat by the window and looked out at the flat Midwest far below and thought about the word yes and what he intended to do with it. The problem arrived Thursday morning. Owen found him at 8:15, earlier than Owen usually found anyone for anything, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of someone carrying information they wish they weren't carrying. He sat down across from Daniel's desk without the usual preamble. "There's something you need to see." He turned his laptop to show the company's internal communication channel a thread in the general staff group posted the previous evening at 7:43 by an account that had since been deleted. The post contained 2 images. The first was from 6 weeks ago, Daniel and Victoria in the hallway of the 11th floor, standing close together in the aftermath of their first Thursday meeting, caught in what was clearly a candid shot taken without either of them knowing. The second was from Tuesday morning in Chicago, the two of them outside the Meridian building facing each other, the particular quality of the distance between them that was not the distance of colleagues after a pitch. The post's text read, "Orion Project Leadership Qualifications or Convenience." The post had been up for 14 hours before someone flagged it for removal. In those 14 hours it had been seen by most of the company. Daniel sat looking at the screen. The photos were both innocent technically, but innocent was not the same as unambiguous, and he understood precisely what had been intended by the pairing of them, by the caption, by the question it planted in the mind of anyone who saw it. "Who posted it?" he said. The account was deleted before anyone could confirm, but Owen paused with the reluctance of someone stepping onto ground they'd rather avoid. "The login timestamp traces back to a device registered to the executive floor." Daniel looked up. "I'm not saying I know," Owen said carefully. "I'm saying that's where it points." He thought about Richard Hollis, the Orion Project, the scope of what had been won in Chicago, the professional consequence of that win, and who had the most to lose from the story of that win being straightforward. "Does Victoria know?" Sloane told her this morning at 7. He stood up, picked up his jacket. Owen's expression shifted into something that was trying to be cautionary and not quite getting there. "Daniel, I know." He put the jacket on. "I know." He took the elevator to 14. Sloane looked up and her expression confirmed everything Owens had implied. Victoria's door was closed, which it almost never was. He knocked. "Come in." She was at the window, which was where he'd found her the first Thursday, and he understood that this was where she went when things required thinking, rather than performing the management of things. She turned when he entered. Her face was composed in the way of someone who had already processed the initial impact and moved into the colder territory of consequence. She spoke first. "I'm going to need you to understand that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with what I said in Chicago." Something tightened in him. "What are you about to say?" "The board has been made aware of the post. Hollis requested an emergency governance call this morning." She kept her voice level with the precision of someone who understood that losing the level would cost her the room. "There is now a formal question on the table about whether my judgment on the Orion personnel decision was compromised by a personal relationship with the person I assigned to lead it. The decision predated anything personal by 3 weeks. The folder, I know, and in those 2 words was the whole weight of someone who knows exactly what is true and exactly how little that currently matters. The question isn't what I know. The question is what the board will decide to do with a story that is easier to tell than the actual one. She looked at him directly. They've asked me to address it. My options as presented by Hollis are to reassign you from Orion or to step down pending a governance review. He stood very still. Those aren't your only options. In the room Hollis has constructed, they appear to be. Then we change the room. His voice came out with a conviction that surprised him slightly, which told him it was coming from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere strategic. What we built in Chicago is real. The Meridian contract is real. The work that led to it is 3 months of documented professional output that existed before anything else, and that documentation doesn't disappear because someone posted 2 photos and asked an insinuating question. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the harbor was doing its usual indifferent business. The light hit the water in small white pieces. I've been doing this long enough to know, she said finally, that being right is not always sufficient. No, but it's where you start. He held her gaze. Don't let him have this. Not the project, not the narrative, not the thing he's actually after, which isn't me, it's you. Something moved in her face. Not the controlled professional expression, and not quite what she'd allowed at dinner either, but something between them, the face of someone recognizing that they've been seen clearly by someone who isn't flinching. She didn't answer right away. The silence in the office was the kind that isn't empty. 48 hours, she said at last. I have 48 hours before the governance call. He nodded, turned toward the door. She spoke behind him, not loud. The project is still yours, Daniel. Whatever happens in that room. He stepped into the hallway and the door closed behind him, and he stood for a moment in the particular quality of that kind of aftermath when the ground has shifted and you can feel it underfoot, but haven't yet seen where everything has settled, and the only thing left to do is decide who you're going to be inside of it. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The building hummed around him with the ordinary business of the day, indifferent to the fact that something had just been altered the way cities always are, the way the world mostly is carrying on. Regardless, while individuals stand at the inflection points of their own lives and discover what they're made of when it costs something to find out. The 48 hours did not pass quietly. Daniel spent Thursday evening at the kitchen table after Mia was asleep, not reviewing Orion deliverables, not doing anything that could be called productive. He was building a record, the complete documentation spread in front of him. Project files arranged by timestamp, the 8-month email chain that showed his work being flagged and cited, and built upon the Meridian contract signed in Chicago with his name listed as lead strategist. Evidence of a story that was simply true, organized with the care of someone who understood that truth requires arrangement to survive noise. Mia found him there at 6:30 Friday morning, still at the table. She looked at the papers, then at him with the economy of someone who had learned to read a room early out of necessity. "Did you sleep?" "Some." She got herself a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it, not filling the silence with anything just present in it. Then she set the glass down. The thing that's worth doing is usually the thing that's complicated. She went to pour cereal. Beverly said it when the pretzels collapsed. But I think it applies to more things. He looked at the back of her head. Then he gathered the documentation into the folder, closed it, and went to make real coffee. The decision had already been made, it just needed the morning to confirm it. He arrived at the office at 8 and went directly to the 14th floor, bypassing his desk, bypassing Owen, bypassing every small preparatory ritual that he normally used to build toward difficult things. This time there was no building toward. He knocked on Victoria's open door, and she looked up from her desk with the face of someone managing something from the inside surface composed structure underneath, visible only to someone who'd been paying attention. He set the folder on her desk. Complete documentation. Every project file with timestamps, every performance note, the full record of the Orion assignment from inception. The creation date on the original proposal is in the header of page 1. He remained standing. This is what the board needs before 2 o'clock. She looked at the folder. I have my own documentation. Then they get both sets. He held her gaze. Don't let Hollis control what information is in the room. She was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of someone deciding rather than hesitating. You understand that a governance board under political pressure doesn't always follow evidence to its logical conclusion. I understand that. He didn't move. I also understand that the logical conclusion is the only one either of us can live with afterward. So we put everything in front of them, and we let them decide, and whatever they decide, we know we didn't manage the truth to make it easier for ourselves. She held his gaze for a long beat. Then she opened the folder and began to read. He left her to it. On the way back to the elevator, he passed the third-floor conference room where the Orion team was already assembled, the walls covered in the visual architecture of the Meridian strategy. He stood in the glass doorway for a moment, looking at the work, at the thing that had been built over months by real people, and felt the particular steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you're standing on. The governance call happened at 2. Daniel was not in it. He was at his desk working on the Meridian Phase 2 framework because the project existed regardless of what was happening on the 14th floor, and the work was still due. And he had told Victoria he wouldn't wait for permission. He already had, and that remained true regardless of the next 2 hours. Owen appeared at 3:45 with an expression that had cleared into something less troubled than the morning. The board reviewed both documentation sets. The timestamps, the project record, the full history. He paused. Hollis submitted a formal statement questioning the personnel decision. The board asked him to provide documentation supporting the conflict of interest claim. He produced the 2 photos and a summary of assumptions. Owen folded his hands. The board found the actual project history substantially more relevant. Daniel set his pen down. And Hollis. The review process opened a question about the internal post, specifically about who created and distributed it using a deleted account. Sloan had been keeping records of device access logs for 3 months. Owen's delivery became careful. Hollis had been using departmental resources to fund personal lobbying activity for a board position at an industry foundation. The investigation that started because of the post found the other thing. He looked at Daniel steadily. He resigned this afternoon pending the full audit. Daniel absorbed this without satisfaction, more with the specific quietness of watching something resolve the way it should, which is not always the way it does. And the distance between those 2 outcomes is the whole of what makes integrity either worth having or merely decorative. "Victoria," he said, still in her office. He went up at 5:15 when the floor had emptied to skeleton crew. Victoria's light was on. He knocked, and she looked different, not diminished, but landed the way people look when something suspended has finally come down. Her jacket was off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and the exhaustion in her face was not being managed. "It's over," she said. "I heard." He sat without ceremony. "How are you?" She looked at him as though translating the question into a register she hadn't used in a while. "Intact." She turned slightly toward the window. "I've been sitting here for an hour thinking about what I would have done if the documentation hadn't been sufficient." "What did you decide?" "That I would have resigned before I let them reassign you to make the problem go away." The words came out as simple fact, not performance. "I want you to know that. It wasn't, I didn't decide it this afternoon. I decided it Thursday morning when I understood what Hollis was building. The project is real. What you built is real. I wasn't going to use you as a solution to a political problem I should have anticipated." He looked at her. The office was quiet enough to hear the ventilation, the low-frequency hum of a structure that had been standing for decades and intended to continue. "When Nora was in the hospital," he said, "there was a doctor who kept telling us what we wanted to hear instead of what was true. He thought managing our expectations was a form of care." He paused. "It wasn't. It was just a way of making himself more comfortable while we made decisions on incomplete information." He looked at Victoria directly. "You've never done that. Not with the project, not with Hollis, not in Chicago. You say the true thing even when the diplomatic thing would be easier. That's not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. "I was taught early that the gap between what looks stable and what is stable can close overnight. A pause, and then something she clearly hadn't planned to say. "My mother left when I was 9. I came home from school and her closet was half empty and my father was at the kitchen table looking at a wall." Her voice remained even. "I stopped relying on appearances after that." He understood at that moment the empty chair. Not as statement, not as performance, the physical habit of someone who had long ago stopped expecting the space beside her to be filled and had kept it empty anyway. Not out of hope necessarily, out of some residual instinct that the space should remain available. "The chair," he said, "in every conference room." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, the specific movement of being seen by someone who isn't flinching from what they see. "Old habit," she said. "I don't examine it." "You don't have to." He held her gaze. "I'm glad I noticed it." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that forms when two people have arrived at the same place and neither of them needs to make it louder than it is. He took Mia to the cemetery on the first Saturday of November. They brought white chrysanthemums because, as Mia had explained to the florist with complete seriousness, they were the color of something that continues. Mia talked the whole time the pretzels, the perspective drawing Beverly's opinion that most things worth doing require one step that seems unnecessary but isn't. She talked about the ocean unit and the argument she'd won about sharks and the deep-sea ecosystems book she was reading with a flashlight after lights out, which Daniel pretended not to know about. He stood beside her and let the November cold settle into his coat and thought about 3 years of standing in this place and how the standing had changed. Not the grief which was permanent in the way weather is permanent, always potentially present, capable of arriving without announcement, but the standing inside it. The first year he'd barely remained upright without it feeling like performance. This year he was actually here, fully here, aware of being alive in a way that felt less like endurance and more like something with a direction. Mia stopped talking and stood quietly, her hand inside his. Then, "I told her about Victoria." He looked down. "What did you tell her?" "That she makes you smile when you think nobody's looking, and that she listens to me like what I say is worth listening to." Mia looked at the headstone with the directness she brought to things she'd thought about carefully. "I thought Mom should know, so she doesn't wonder." He tightened his hand around hers and didn't try to speak for a moment. The cold moved through the trees above them, that particular sound of late autumn wind through branches with no leaves left to soften it. "Is that okay?" Mia asked, genuinely asking. "Yes," he managed. "That's exactly right." The box was in the back of the closet where things go when you need them accessible and invisible simultaneously. He'd opened it twice in 3 years, once the first week, once on the first anniversary. He opened it now on a Sunday evening while Mia was at Beverly's sitting on the bedroom floor with the box in his lap and the closet light throwing a yellow rectangle across the rug. The journal was near the bottom beneath the photograph from their first apartment and the folded program from the concert she'd dragged him to on their second date. He'd known it was there. He hadn't read past the first few pages because the handwriting had been too much, the particular slant of it, the way she pressed harder on certain words without knowing she was doing it. He opened it now to the last entries. Her handwriting in those final weeks was more deliberate. Each letter formed with the care of someone who understood these words would eventually need to carry weight. She wrote about Mia with a specificity that was almost unbearable. Not general maternal love, but the granular record of someone cataloging a person they were going to miss knowing. She wrote about the apartment and the morning light in the kitchen. She wrote about being tired in a way that had stopped frightening her. And then near the final entry, dated 11 days before February, "Daniel is going to feel like starting again," is a betrayal. He'll carry this like it needs to be carried forever, like putting it down means I mattered less. That's not how it works. I want him to put it down when he's ready, not because it wasn't real, because it was real enough that he should know what real feels like when he finds it again. He'll know when he finds it. He'll pick up his camera. He sat on the floor for a long time. The closet light hummed. Outside, the city went on in its usual way. He reached up to the shelf above the box without standing. The camera had been sitting there for 3 weeks, moved from the drawer without a conscious decision, and took it down. Held it in both hands. Sat with the weight of it, and the weight of the journal, and the weight of 3 years, and found that he could hold all of it at once without any of it canceling out the others. That was new. He understood the whole point. He put the camera on the floor beside him, put the journal back in the box with the care it deserved, closed the box. He did not put the camera away again. He took the watch to a jeweler on Monday, a small shop in the South End that had been there for 40 years, and looked at the kind of place that understood what objects meant to the people who brought them in. The man behind the counter listened without interrupting while Daniel explained what he wanted. "A pendant for my daughter. Simple, not decorative. Something she can wear when she's older, something that feels like it was made for holding on to." The jeweler turned the watch over in his careful hands. "There's good metal here. It'll make a clean conversion." He set it on the velvet square between them. "How old is your daughter?" 8. "I'll make it durable enough to grow with her." He looked up. "She'll have it for a long time." "That's the idea," Daniel said. He walked out without the watch for the first time in 3 years. His wrist felt the same. His chest felt like something had quietly exhaled after a very long breath. He told Mia that evening. She was at the kitchen table with the Deep Sea Ecosystems book, a bowl of cereal going stale beside her because she'd forgotten it, and she listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, which indicated the weight she was assigning it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not going to need to look at it anymore." "No," he said. "I've got it here now." He put a hand to his chest. "But you should have something you can actually carry with you." Mia held his gaze for a long moment with those sea-green eyes that had always been her mother's. Then she nodded once, the gravity of a child ratifying something she'd understood before it was said. "Okay," she said, and went back to her book. And that was all it needed to be. He stayed at the table for a while after watching her read the book held with both hands, face close to the page, the way she got when something genuinely absorbed her, and thought about all the ordinary evenings that had accumulated into the life they had, all of it built without a plan, improvised from the pieces of something broken, and how the thing they'd built had turned out to be stronger than the breaking of it. The camera was on the shelf in the living room. He'd put it there after Sunday without thinking about it, the way you put something in the place it belongs when you finally know where that is. He picked up his phone, texted Victoria. "Are you free Saturday evening? Mia will be at Beverly's. I was thinking dinner. The real kind. 2 minutes." He counted them. Victoria Strand. The real kind. Yes. Saturday arrived with the ordinary momentum of a day that doesn't know it's important. Mia supervised the preparations with the authority of someone who had given this considerable thought, declared that he should wear the blue shirt, and delivered a detailed briefing to Beverly about acceptable dinner options before allowing herself to be driven over at 4. At Beverly's front path, she turned back through the car window. "Don't forget, blue shirt." Then she walked inside. He wore the blue shirt. Victoria arrived at 7. She stepped into the apartment and looked around the way she looked at everything with genuine attention, not social registration. She looked at Mia's drawings above the radiator. She looked at the kitchen with its warm light and something on the stove. She looked at the shelf in the living room where the camera now sat beside the Carver book, and she looked at the table beside the couch where nothing sat anymore, just clean wood. She didn't comment on the empty table. But she noticed, and he saw her notice, and the space between them had the quality of two people who have stopped needing things explained. He had cooked from scratch. Mia had left a note card on the counter that morning with the pasta steps written out in her handwriting, which he chose to accept as encouragement rather than doubt. Victoria sat at the counter while he finished it, and they talked the way they'd been talking for months easily, and without construction, the conversation moving through work and Mia and the things they'd been reading. Underneath all of it was the knowledge that this was the real version of what had been building since October, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. They ate at the kitchen table. She talked about the structural work following Hollis's resignation, the quiet, difficult process of rebuilding something that had been operating with a fault line in it for longer than anyone had wanted to see. He talked about a problem in the Meridian Phase 2 messaging architecture he'd finally found the angle on that afternoon. At some point, the dinner became less about the food and more about the table. the specific quality of two people in a space being used for exactly what it was made for. After dinner, she stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below while he made coffee, and she said, "I wrote a letter." He looked up. "To Nora." She kept her eyes on the window. "I kept trying to find the right way to say something to you about her, not to manage anything. Not to acknowledge it in some formulaic way, but to say something actually true. I couldn't find the form until I understood that the thing I needed to say was to her, not to you." She turned. "I can give it to you if you want, or not. It's not a document. It's just something I needed to write to be honest about where I am." He looked at her, at the specificity of what she'd just offered, the cost of it, the way she'd said it without softening the edges or asking him to receive it gently. 2 months ago, he might have needed time to answer. He didn't need time. "I want to read it," he said. She took an envelope from her coat pocket and set it on the counter between them. His name on the front in her precise handwriting. He picked it up and held it in both hands and didn't open it yet, just held it the way you hold something you know will matter. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he set the envelope on the counter, and she put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his own, and they stayed like that, just that, no ceremony around it, no announcement. Two people who had found their way to the same place and were simply standing in it. He kissed her. She kissed him back with the full attention she brought to everything she decided was worth her attention, which was the most specific thing she knew how to give, and which he understood by now was not given lightly. He read the letter after she left, sitting on the couch in the quiet apartment with the city doing its late-night business outside. Her handwriting was small and exact, and she had crossed out 2 words and left the crossings visible, which told him she'd written it by hand without drafting it first. It said, "Nora, I didn't know you. I know you through the way your daughter trusts that things work out, which is not a quality children develop without evidence. I know you through the man you loved, who is careful in the way of someone who has held something irreplaceable and understands what that means. I'm not here to take anything that was yours. I'm here because I think the things you built in him and in Mia are worth being near, and because I'm going to try to be worth being near in return. I don't know yet if I'll succeed, but I know it matters enough to try seriously. That's the only thing I can promise with any honesty. I think you would understand that." He folded the letter, sat with it for a moment, not in the heaviness of grief but in something adjacent to gratitude for the fact that the world sometimes produces people willing to do the hard, careful thing when the easier thing is available. He put the letter in the box in the closet next to Nora's journal, not stored away, not hidden, placed with the other things that deserved to be kept in the company of the past. He was still carrying differently now, with different hands toward somewhere he could finally see. He went to bed. Did not check his phone again. The camera was on the shelf in the living room, where it would be in the morning, where it would be after that. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, with winter installed and committed, Daniel was standing at the kitchen counter when he heard Mia's voice shift into the register of serious debate. She and Victoria were at the kitchen table, a geography that had become unremarkable in 3 weeks, the way some things move from new to simply true faster than you expect, and Mia was making the case for the anglerfish as the superior evolutionary achievement with the organized conviction of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than the conversation had been happening. Victoria was losing and knew it. She maintained her position anyway, which Mia was finding both frustrating and Daniel could tell secretly satisfying, because being taken seriously enough to be argued with is its own form of respect, and Mia at 8 was already sophisticated enough to feel the difference. He picked up the camera from the counter where he'd set it down earlier without thinking, the way you reach for something that has returned to its natural place. He raised it, found them in the frame. Mia mid-gesture with a spoon, Victoria with her chin in her hand, the expression on her face caught in the specific moment between exasperation and delight that has no clean name but is one of the better things a face can do. He pressed the button. The shutter clicked. Mia looked up. "Did you just take a picture of us?" He looked at the small screen. The image there, the two of them in the winter light from the window, the table with its Sunday morning arrangement of cereal bowls and library books, the easy disorder of a room being lived in without apology. "Yeah," he said. I did. Victoria was looking at him now with the quality of attention that was entirely hers, the kind that made being seen feel like permission rather than exposure. She didn't say anything. She just looked, and he looked back, and Mia turned to Victoria with the verdict of someone whose patience for digression has limits. "The anglerfish wins," Mia announced. "It grew its own light in a place where there is no light. That's not adaptation. That's an argument." She pointed the spoon at Victoria for emphasis. Victoria looked at her for a beat. Then, despite herself, without warning, she laughed the real version, the one that changed her face entirely, the one Daniel had been quietly cataloging since the dinner in Chicago, because it was rare enough to be worth remembering each time. He lowered the camera. The image was already saved. That night, after Mia was asleep and the apartment had settled into its particular nighttime quiet, he sat on the couch and looked at the photograph on the camera's small screen for a while. Not analyzing it, just looking at it the way you look at a true thing at the light, at his daughter's certainty, at Victoria's unguarded face in the moment she stopped performing composure and simply responded to an 8-year-old who refused to lose an argument about fish. He thought about what Nora had written. He'll know when he finds it. He'll pick up his camera. He set the camera down on the table beside the couch. The table that had held the watch for 3 years, that now held nothing, that now held this, and picked up his phone. "Good night," he typed. Sent it before he could add anything. 3 seconds. Victoria Strand. That's it. No little star. He smiled at the phone in the dark of the apartment, at the particular pleasure of being known by someone well enough to be teased, which is its own specific kind of intimacy, and one he'd forgotten was available to him. "Good night, Victoria," he typed. "You're one now." He set the phone on the table beside the camera, looked at the ceiling in the dark, heard the radiator doing its small, faithful work, heard Mia breathing down the hall, that steady rhythm that was the most reliable sound in his life. He did not check the phone again. The apartment was quiet around him, the same walls, the same floors, the same view of the same Boston street through the same window. Nothing had been replaced, nothing had been erased. The box in the closet held what it held. Mia wore a pendant that was being made from something that had been a watch, that had been a marriage, that had been a life. The camera was on the table. The photograph was saved. He closed his eyes. The city went on outside, indifferent and necessary. And Daniel Mercer, who had spent 3 years learning that surviving something and living through it are not the same. Instruction felt the difference settle into him at last, not as a conclusion, not as a lesson learned, but as a simple present-tense fact. He was here, it was his, and he intended to stay.